Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Andrew with chapter 15, possibly the last chapter, episode in the amazing true story of how I became the All American boy in Vietnam. Well, anyhow, after we played in the Trang, had a nice night, and the next day we were flown down to. It wasn't Saigon, but it was someplace fairly close to Saigon, maybe Bien Hoa. But anyhow, I'll tell you one thing about that place for sure. The mosquitoes were the size of robins. I mean, they were humongous and they were hungry. They're hungry mosquitoes. And unfortunately, even though we had nice sleeping quarters and nice military beds there, there was no mosquito netting. And, they gave us some bug repellent, but those mosquitoes feasted on DEET like, well, it was a terrible situation. We were being eaten alive. My solution was to go and get in the shower. And they had lovely showers there. And I stood under the nice warm water. Wasn't actually warm, wasn't actually cold, it was just tepid. And the mosquitoes could not penetrate that water shield. So I was very happy with that. And I stayed in that shower for hours and hours and finally got tired and had to sit down. And as soon as I sat down, sleep overwhelmed me. And so there I was on the cement floor in that shower with the water pouring over me. And I just slept until almost to dawn. I finally got up and I put my clothes on. And I guess the mosquitoes were sleeping because when I walked out of the shower, things were copacetic. And so I started walking, just exploring as I had in other places. And I soon found the back gate to this compound where we were. And I was thinking about walking down into the village. And then I heard this commotion down the street. And I decided that discretion was a better part of valor, and I would just hang back and see what was happening. And this crowd of people came up the street. It was like a parade in a way. And in the midst of the parade was a tiger cage on wheels. And if you've never heard of tiger cages, let me describe a brief introduction to torture. And in the tiger cage, you could not stand up. You could not sit down. You could not lie down. The only thing you could do was crouch. And it was miserably uncomfortable for anybody that's ever been in a confined situation like that. And there was a naked man inside the tiger cage, presumably a Viet Cong or an NVA, not an American, not a Caucasian. Well, it made me think seriously about the dynamic of the United States being at war in Vietnam. And why were we there? Well, we were there because the United States was convinced that if South Vietnam fell and became communist, that the Chinese would roll out through Southeast Asia. The Chinese position is that, for 1,000 years, the Chinese had basically been the rulers in Southeast Asia. I'm just moving around trying to check that light. Well, so that's better. The Chinese had declared that They were the masters of Southeast Asia, and they were determined to resume their rightful place in history as the rulers of Southeast Asia. And that would have meant Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and Indonesia and all the way down to Australia would become communist under Chinese domination. Well, the Americans determined that that was not going to happen. And that's where the so-called domino theory came from. Well, my contention is that the United States actually won the war in Southeast Asia because is Laos communist? No. Is Cambodia communist? No. Is Thailand communist? No. Is Indonesia communist? No. Is Australia communist? No. So the United States had been pretty effective in helping the Vietnamese to develop their natural resources. You know, their oil and their tin and their chrome and their... anyhow, I'm digressing from the story. So anyhow, there we were, and, we played our performance, and it was, kind of uneventful. By that point, it was almost boring to be on tour, because all we did was wait until it was time to play and then go play for our show. And it was getting boring playing the same old songs over and over again. But we were blessed in that we were just about at the end of the tour. This was like, day 98 out of 100. And we went to Saigon right after that. And when we were in Saigon, we were going to get an award. I remember we were going to get an Army commendation that was presented by a general that was responsible for the special services. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. I didn't let that stop me from getting enormously high on that Bong San weed. I'd left most of my stash in Trang, locked up in my foot locker. Well, so there we were in Saigon, and we had a couple of days until we were going to make a performance. Apparently, it had gotten around that we were a pretty good band. And what is happening here? We were a pretty good band, and we were going to play at the Saigon Embassy, the American Embassy in Saigon. And that was cool. But we had a couple of days. And so the first day, we were just chilling with the special services guys, and they took us for a meal, and we went to the lounge in the St. George Hotel. I believe it was the St. George. It might have been the Caravel Hotel. I can't remember. But, oh my God, there was a 7-piece Vietnamese band with horns, and they were kick-ass. I mean, they were so good that it made me feel embarrassed that with our little guitar band, we just couldn't hold a candle to these guys. And they could sing, and they could harmonize, and they had dancers and bimbos. Well, that was cool. And then we went up on the roof of the hotel and watched the Rockets come in on Tom Sinnott, smoking those Park Lane cigarettes with filters. Oh, no, they weren't tobacco cigarettes, but they were in a pack of cigarettes. They looked just like Winston's, called Park Lanes. And boy, oh boy, smoked and smoked and smoked. Well, the next day, we had nothing on our agenda. So one of our friends there from Special Services, he says, "You guys ever been to Cholon?" I said, "What's Cholon?" And Cholon was like the Chinese ghetto um, for Saigon. It was the Vietnamese equivalent of Harlem in New York City, and primarily Chinese, Vietnamese. And let me tell you, when I was there in Vietnam, there was nobody more racist than the Vietnamese. They hated the Montagnards, the Anan people, the native indigenous people, and they hated the Chinese people that had intermarried with the Vietnamese people. And it was kind of like being a half breed in the American West, where the Caucasians would intermarry with the Native Americans. So there we were, and we were exploring in Cholon, and went into a jewelry store and purchased a new pair of rose-colored glasses so I could look like John Lennon and have my picture taken with the general wearing these glasses. And, well, then we went over. You guys want to have lunch? We have a friend that lives down here, an American. So we went to have lunch with this American friend of his, and he was a deserter. And what had happened is that this guy was a Marine up in Da Nang, and he had fallen in love with a Vietnamese girl and had a baby. And he didn't want to go back to the States. And so he made arrangements to be kidnapped. And he was kidnapped, and he and his wife were taken off into the countryside. And he was listed by the Marine Corps as an MIA. But in actuality, he was, the way I heard the story is that he was a deserter. And so anyhow, really a nice guy, had a stash of some nice Vietnamese marijuana. He offered us some opium, and he offered us some other, had some vials of what they call number 10 juice. And I think what that was pure Vietnamese dexedrine. Well, anyhow, I say that a lot, don't I? Well, anyhow, to carry the story forward, I got a chance to meet Bobby Garwood and his wife and his children. He had several other children, or a couple of other children, I think, by then. And he was determined to live his good life in Cholon, there in Vietnam. He'd given up his American citizenship. Well, I'm not certain of the circumstances, but I know that Bobby Garwood was returned on his own power to America in 1979. And there was a huge controversy of whether he was a prisoner of war, as he claimed, or whether he was a deserter, as many in the military claimed. And so, more power to you, Bobby. I think you're still alive. God bless you. And it was nice meeting you in Cholon. Well, there we were, the last night of our last afternoon, actually, of our tour, because we were playing in the early afternoon over at the embassy. And so we sat up and had a lackluster performance. I mean, it was okay, but nothing like our best stuff when, Anthony was dancing up a storm. And, well, it was a lackluster performance. But there was one good thing. There were a lot of VIPs there at the embassy, and one of them was the industrialist who sold all of the milk to the military in Vietnam, and it wasn't fresh milk like we have here in Provo every day. This was called filled milk, and with filled milk, what they did was they extracted all of the fat from the milk, from the fresh milk in the States, and sent this powder, this milk powder, to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, it was reconstituted with vegetable oil. And it sucked. It was terrible. Tasted terrible, and was no good for you, I don't think. But anyhow, can't say that the GIs didn't have milk, because they did. They had filled milk, and it was relatively fresh. So anyhow, the industrialist that made that filled milk, he had brought his daughter. Now, she was a California beach bunny. I mean, she had American Caucasian figure in abundance. I mean, she was well endowed, born to be a mom, if you know what I mean. And so when I was introduced to her, I was just taken. She was a cute girl, and apparently she was taken with me. And I think what she was really taken with is she could smell the marijuana all over me and wanted me to turn her on. And so, sure, come on with me. And so we went to a secluded courtyard where there was no traffic. I felt safe. And so she and I smoked a joint, and then we shared another. And we were both pretty high at that point. And I forget exactly what happened or exactly how it happened, but I felt that she was drawing me out, trying to get me to describe how much I hated America and how much I hated the government of America for sending me to Vietnam. And I didn't feel that way. I felt blessed to live with the Constitution and to, in spite of the fact that I'd really lost all of my civil rights when I enlisted in the Army. I mean, you have to follow the orders of the president, etc. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So I was trying to explain this concept to her about all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I didn't really understand what was happening, but she started kissing me. Well, naturally, I started kissing her back, and it was glorious. I mean, the more I kissed her back, the more turned on she got. And the more turned on she got, the more turned on I got. And oh my golly day, the Roman hands. That was me. And I was all over her body. And the more I got all over her body, the more turned on she got. And right when I thought she was going to rip my clothes off and rip her own clothes off, there in that courtyard, she glanced at her wristwatch and said, "Oh, geez, I gotta go." But before she went, she reached down and grabbed my package in a very provocative way. And of course, I had to me, it seemed like an enormous erection. And she says, "Oh, my, you really are the all-American boy." You kidding me? I have done all of this to become the All-American boy in Saigon with you? Well, that's how I became the All-American boy. Well, the next day we went, and I never saw this girl again. Never had any further contact with her again. And, I was disappointed with that. I really wanted to enjoy my relationship with her. But that was not to be. But I did get an Army Commendation Medal. And in that picture, I still have a copy of the picture of getting the medal. But it wasn't enough to just get my picture taken. I had to get my picture taken with my hands like this. And then, first I tried to do this, but the photographer wouldn't have it. He said, come on. And so I hid it over here. And I have that picture. I'll show it to you one of these days. So we're finishing up. Went back to my unit, and I think it was somewhat of a celebrity in my unit because, first of all, it was the ghost, and whenever there was some dirty job to do, they had to get somebody else because they couldn't see me. And by that time, I was pretty short. I think I had 6 or 7 weeks left in Vietnam. I went to the first sergeant. I said, First Sergeant, don't even think about sending me back to the field. I know that my replacement is here. He's been doing this job for the last 100 days. Don't even try and send me to the field, because if you try and send me to Vietnam, or try and send me to the field, you're going to have to send me to jail, because I'm going to make so much trouble for you. You shouldn't, me, boy? Well, anyhow, at that point, I became the permanent CQ. And CQ is charge of quarters. And my job was to answer the telephone from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, that was fine with me, If I got bored, I'd step outside and smoke a joint. And nobody said anything to me, because they figured that I had political connections. Well, I did have political connections. I had a girlfriend back in Washington, Washington, D.C., whose father was a high-ranking official in the government. And she had, through her father, got a phone number to the Pentagon to hook into a system called the Audubon. And in Audubon system, you can call any place there's a military base, or you could in 1968. And so there I was, back in, back in Nha Trang, and I started getting phone calls from Washington, and I don't think they understood in Washington that it was 12 hours earlier or 12 hours later in Vietnam, because it was on the other side of the world. And day and night I'd get these phone calls from, this girl's name was Karen. And I think it blew everybody's mind that I was getting phone calls from the United States. How do you rate that, Wilson? Nobody gets phone calls in Vietnam. Oh. What can I say? Nobody else plays in a rock and roll band in Vietnam either, do they? Do they? Oh, man. So it happened. And before you knew it, I have to admit that as I got very short in Vietnam, each day, each week that went by, I became more and more obsessed with the likelihood that rockets would come in unexpectedly and end my life. And I was never really worried about losing my life in Vietnam. I figured that I was that I was living a charmed life. I think I told you about the time when we were back in the woodpile, and I just said to Travis and the boys, I said, guys, we got to get out of here. I mean, I just feel that we must get out of here. And, later on, crunch, in come the rockets. And that was the closest that the rockets ever came to the 281st Company area, was when they blew up the woodpile. Well, before I knew it, the time had expired, and 3 days before I was supposed to leave for Vietnam, I got so sick. I had a fever like 103. Oh, I felt terrible. I thought, I'm not going to be able to go home. They're going to put me in the hospital, blah, 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 blah. So I still had a half a shopping bag filled with Bong Son marijuana. I mean, there must have been a couple of pounds of marijuana. And when it came time for me to leave, I just went to. I had a friend who was. I think I mentioned him before. His name was Jack. Well, Jack Petty is actually his name. He's dead now, but I said, take this, enjoy it, and think of me when you're high. And that was basically my parting shot at the 281st. I had to say goodbye to Susie. I bought her a couple of grilled ham and cheese sandwiches, and if I had been able to bring her back to the States, I certainly would have. But it was crystal clear when I talked to the chain of command that was not to be. Susie was the 281st Company dog. I had no right to take her. And furthermore, they were going to make every administrative roadblock they could to prevent me taking that dog. So when the time came, I packed up my guitar and my duffel bag and went to Cameron Bay and climbing the gangplank up into the 707, and everybody is celebrating going home. And at the top of the stairs with his clipboard, the sergeant said, "What the hell do you have there, boy? Is that a guitar?" I said, "Sure is." So I brought it with me from home over to Vietnam, and I'm taking it home. And he started giving me some stuff. And I said, well, I won't tell you what I told him, because it was this swear word that begins with F-U, Sergeant so-and-so. If you think you're going to keep me off of this airplane, you're out of your mind. He said, "What are you going to do to punish me? Send me to Vietnam?" That became sort of a mantra for me. What are you going to do? Send me to Vietnam? Well, I came back to the United States, and as we were flying into SeaTac, there's going to be out-processed in Fort Lewis, Washington. So we're flying into SeaTac. And man, we were flying into SeaTac, and that 707 just did this abrupt banking maneuver. And the pilot came on the line and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we were almost in a collision with a Piper Cub. I hate these." And this, God, what a way to die. Then a plane crash in SeaTac after serving a year in Vietnam. Well, that was quite an adventure. The biggest, rowdiest adventure of my life. Which is not to say that I haven't had some other adventures. I mean, I did join a band when I got back to the States, and I did write some songs, and I did get a recording contract with Paramount Records, so I thought I was Mr. King shit. But it was, to keep it all in perspective, I am, to this day, the all-American boy. I believe that when I took that oath to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that made me the mortal enemy of a lot of people in government. And I will, to this day, extol the virtues of the Constitution of the United States and the 10 amendments to the Constitution. And I'm one of the few people I know who actually has a copy of the Constitution in my car. I carry it around with me in case somebody needs it. You need to be educated about the Constitution of the United States. Well, anyhow, I do love America. I am so glad that I had the courage to serve in the military and do my part to defend the values. And, the Republic, it's like when we were little kids, we all would recite every day, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the Republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, the reason I point this out is because one of the core values of the Republic is that we're indivisible. It is a nefarious conspiracy for the Reds and the Blues to be at each other's throats. And I want to testify, like Martin Luther King testified, that it is not the Republicans against the Democrats or the Democrats against the Republicans. What it really is the rich against the poor. And that we are a nation under God, indivisible. Now, under God means, I don't care if you're a Muslim or a Hindu or a Catholic or a Presbyterian or a Mormon, or I don't care if you're an atheist. This is a nation under God, indivisible, and this is the key point, with liberty and justice. Not just for some, but for everyone. Liberty and justice for all. So